Friday afternoon. Last talk. You'll be glad to know that I anticipated that. I threw out my corporate presentation. It's on your USB. I'm not going to talk about our corporate structure and our background and our track record and our market cap. Geologists on Friday afternoon, which is what I am, that's our time for a little bit of arm waving. So I'm just going to give you an example of a copper gold porphyry project that we're working on in Nevada that is interesting. It is fun, and the value creation potential is actually hard to quantify, so I'm just going to walk you through some rocks, and I don't think there's a chart, table, or graph in here, and my hope is that we can, thank you, segue this into actually talking about rocks and exploration when the bar opens, because I do think that's the root of our business. Okay, what is this? This is it used to be a black and white salt and pepper diorite. It is now all white clay with some beautiful tetrahedrite and tennantite and azure copper after some chalcopyrite. That's at surface. That's nice. If you're looking for porphyry copper mineralization, that's it. It's not 500 meters down. If you go over the ridge and you look at this rock, it's a different phase of the batholith, and you'll notice there's no black spots anymore because they've been replaced by brown biotite. And this rock is hotter than the last rock. And when you look at those veins and you look at those cracked seal textures of quartz inside iron oxide, that gets any Chilean porphyry geologist excited, because that really is what a porphyry is. Cracked, resealed, reprecipitated veins in a hot, altered potassic rock. I went and looked at this property 3 years ago because of those rocks, and if you're a geologist and that doesn't get you excited, you need to get out of the business. That is an IOCG breccia, which when I get these submittals, I'm usually a little bit skeptical, but that is a iron oxide buffered hydrothermal breccia, altered granite fragments with copper, gold, and elevated light rare earths. So if Murray Hintzman from the Colorado School of Mines was sitting right there, that fits. And that's something as a geologist, honestly, you don't see every day. But why that rock is really exciting is because when you make a slab and you stain it with this acid and it turns yellow, it means that it's potassic alteration. And that means that you've moved from the periphery of a porphyry system into the heart. So when you see that rock associated with those rocks, it's exciting, especially when you can see the copper mineralization in the way you want to see it at surface. So I walked onto this property 3 years ago, and that scale bar of a kilometer, that's 6 kilometers across east-west by about 5 north-south. And those are our unusual copper numbers. And they're coming from those altered diorites, that really hot altered granite, and from the specularite breccias themselves. And you can see a couple of samples in the middle that are carrying 4 to 8 grams gold. And although initially we wondered about that gold being a separate epithermal system, it isn't, because this is an alkaline system. It's hotter. And those gold numbers make sense with a hotter alkaline system like Galore Creek, for example, in BC. So that is a big footprint of big copper numbers at surface. So I'm a geologist, we just kept spending money. And we did a high-resolution airborne survey. That's what this is. The grid is about 10 by 10 kilometers. And what you see is that all of those black names are the showings where you can see this copper sulfide at surface. And you see how you can see the magnetic grain in the lower part of that map from basalts and diorites and volcanic rocks. And you go into the center part of that map inside that dashed line, and the magnetism is washed out into these pale yellows. So everything in the middle of that area, in that property, is demagnetized. And it's telling you that the footprint of the hydrothermal system that formed all of these copper gold showings is large, and that there was one unified system that accounts for those gold and copper rocks. They're not little isolated, little fluffy little showings that aren't rooted in a big system. And visually, we did a 3D inversion of this magnetic survey. So if you cut a line across that and imagine it's like a slice of a cake. You can see that the whole center part of that inversion is demagnetized. It's that pale yellow and those reds and pinks on the outside are these granites like your kitchen counter that have not been altered. And that inversion is 2,000 meters in modeling. So it's telling you that large footprint of hydrothermal alteration is deeply rooted. And if you went back to that first beautiful slide of copper, and you think it's tied into a big Bingham Canyon porphyry copper system, it needs to be deeply rooted. And that inversion actually was done a year after the survey by a group in Denver. And it does give us a lot of conviction that this Bonita property is unusual. So here's my one, corporate talk to keep my banker happy. After 4 years of working on that, spending about $600,000, we went public in March, GMP and PI, RTO with a shell, $4 million financing, 35 million shares, 20% to insiders, mostly myself, 3 big mining long institutions. The goal of that financing is to fund a 2-year exploration strategy for copper and gold in the US. And you can go to the corporate presentation to look at that. But the real focus was to drill what I view as probably the most unusual early stage exploration property I've worked on. And that's what we're doing right now. Whoops. That's our tent. That's our fly camp. And maybe that's one of my messages here is that VR is a company that does like to get its hands dirty. The biggest surprise with this property was, this is a complicated geology map of western US. You can see the Yarrington right almost in the middle at 168. That MA is million years. So Yarrington is Nevada's most famous copper camp. It's early Jurassic, like many of the porphyry coppers in BC that you've heard about, like what Pretium's working on, et cetera, et cetera. We did some geochronology at Bonita, 3 age dates, and you can see the age of Bonita is 166. We weren't expecting that. If you go to all the geological literature, these rocks are thought to be younger. So the idea here is that the northern extension of the Yarrington Arc that formed the Yarrington camp is what Bonita is, and that's not expected. Anaconda wasn't thinking that in the 70s. Bear Creek wasn't thinking that in the 70s. And it's our competitive advantage to understand that the reason that copper footprint of Bonita is so exciting is because it's the exact same age as Yarrington. Okay, here's my segue into something topical that Gwen was talking about. An article from the Globe and Mail last week, Grasberg in Indonesia, arguably the greatest copper deposit that's ever been found. Finally, Freeport looks like they're going to be losing control of Grasberg to the Indonesian government. I think Grasberg generates $14 billion a year in cash flow. It's like 1% copper sticking out of the ground in a mountain. You go to the western US and you look at some of these M&A activity in the last 4 years. And Freeport is doing a $200 million JV on the Bear deposit. And you ask yourself, Bear was discovered 60 years ago by Anaconda. Why is Freeport doing that? Freeport is telling you Indonesia is not their future. And what I would have added to Gwen's comments was, why has the copper price gone from $2 to $3? Look at how copper companies have been treated in jurisdictions like Indonesia, Pakistan, Mongolia, Alaska, heaven forbid. And look at how the big copper projects in the world are not coming along the way we want. And so Freeport is saying, how about Nevada? We had a drill permit in 3 weeks. There are world-class porphyry copper camps there, and it hasn't been explored for in 30 or 40 years. Ultimately, what VR wants to do is give Freeport a new Bear deposit, a new Yarrington camp, because I think that's what they're looking for. That's Yarrington. Look at those 4 deposits, Bear, MacArthur, and Mason. 500 million to 2 billion pounds, probably 16 to 25 billion pounds of copper. Those are geological models, not resource estimates. But it's an indication of the copper endowment of the western US, which since 1980 has been essentially ignored. When we got the age date for Bonita, I took this hydrothermal footprint for Bonita, drawn to scale, and I put it on the Yarrington camp, because we now know that Bonita is the same age as Yarrington. And it's almost eerie how similar it is. We look at the size of some of these drill targets on Bonita. This is an IP anomaly with a 700-meter gravity anomaly. Look at the Yarrington deposit at the bottom. It's 800 meters long by 80 meters wide. So the Bonita system is like Yarrington. The Bonita targets are like the Yarrington deposits themselves. That's an IP anomaly at the top that comes to surface. That's nice. You just drill through the chargeability anomaly, hoping your sulfides continue. That's an IP chargeability anomaly at the top that's 1,000 meters wide, a couple hundred meters down. That's the dimensions of something like the Yarrington deposit. Polyphase batholith, repeated granite stocks coming into it with copper veins at surface, and those black lines are just the drill holes that we're doing right now to understand, does the Bonita system not only have the chance to discover a deposit, but to actually put a new porphyry camp on the map? And that's what we're doing right now, and I'm just giving guidance to people to understand we're not really looking for just a copper intersection. We're trying to understand, could we actually put a major new porphyry camp into the western US, which hasn't happened in a while. This is my last slide. I want to just give my parting message on what I learned from the big transactions in the Athabasca, which I was lucky enough to be a part of. Rough Rider was the third highest grade uranium deposit in the world. Rio Tinto came in and wrote a check for $650 million. And people would say, oh, that's great, Mike. You've got Rio coming in with Cameco. It's all over. And I said to them, there were three things going on at that time. Fukushima, within 48 hours of Anderson Cooper on CNN, Fukushima wiped out 35 to 65% of that entire industry. Rio Tinto still wrote that check. Price of uranium had gone from $140 to $60. Rio Tinto still wrote that check. Rio Tinto had taken their first $18 billion write-down on the Alcan acquisition, and they still wrote that check. So what I'm telling you as resource investors, when you make a world-class discovery in a world-class district, they operate outside of the macroeconomics. So it's not that I don't care about the price of copper. Of course I care about the price of copper. If Bonita is a new Yarrington camp, the 6 big copper companies in the world are going to care because it's going to get the copper industry excited, because the copper industry is getting beaten up in places like Indonesia. That's really the lesson and the conviction for why I'm spending $1 million on this financing on this drill program, because I believe that Bonita can do to the copper industry what Rough Rider did to the uranium industry. And it's especially when you're in the grind. That check that Tom Albanese wrote at Rio Tinto was not an easy check for him to write, even though they're the second largest mining company in the world. That's why we do exploration, because if you make that discovery, it happens outside of the norm of the macroeconomics. So with that, I'm hoping there's some geology and exploration discussion.